switch gears and go into, I'm not going to say my favorite topic, but one that I've been immersed in for 28 years, and that's school finance. So I have attempted to break this down to a very basic level. Please understand that it is not this simple, but the general concept is. I want to introduce Joseph Riggs. Joseph is our Director of Finance. He joined the district in August, and so he's going to be assisting me throughout our hands-on demonstration. So we have some props. I like to say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but a show and tell is worth 1,000,000 words. So we'll go through this as we hit some of the slides. So our objectives for this morning. Anybody consider themselves a school finance expert? All right. I may need you in my office. This is a complicated topic. Do you believe that schools get more revenue when property taxes increase? A lot of people think that is the case. Could you explain recapture on an elevator to a total stranger?
Going to what floor?
First to the third. All right, so hopefully when we are done with this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of how school finance in Texas works. You'll be able to explain these general concepts to your neighbors and friends. So if you can't explain the general concepts, then we need to go through this again. And then understand the correlation between higher property values and the revenues that the district actually gets to keep. So we have a lot of terminology and a lot of acronyms in education. School finance is exactly the same. So I want to make sure we all understand these basic funding elements. So the first one is called the basic allotment. And that is what state law says every student in the state of Texas is worth. And that's $6,160. So all of these students here, each one of them is worth that amount of money, no matter if you're in the Panhandle or the coastal region, Central Texas, across the state. That is something that we're hoping this legislative session will address. It was set at 6160 in House Bill 3 in 2019, and we all know that the world has changed drastically since then. The entitlement. The entitlement, you're going to hear that word a lot. This is the Tier 1 guaranteed revenue amount. So we're going to talk about how that amount is determined. That's what we're guaranteed to earn in revenue, and then the question becomes, who will fund that entitlement? Will it be local property taxes? Will it be the state? Will it be a combination of both? The guarantee yield, this comes into play when we talk about golden and copper pennies. I hate talking school finance and going into golden and copper pennies because I feel like it's too far in the weeds, but you really have to have that conversation. So we're going to talk about the guaranteed yield on these extra pennies. The local share, that's the portion of that Tier 1 entitlement. The local share is what the district is responsible for funding, and that's going to depend on the district's property value wealth and the tax rate. And then the state share. So if the local share doesn't cover the full Tier 1 entitlement, that's when the state will kick in some assistance. When we look at our acronyms, we talk a lot about ADA and WADA, weighted ADA. So ADA is our average daily attendance. Over the course of the school year, how many kids actually showed up? There are some other conversations floating around in the legislature right now because Texas funds on attendance, not enrollment. I believe there's 6 states in the nation that still fund on ADA and not enrollment. It would definitely cost the state to fund based on the number of kids enrolled. But when you think about it, when we plan for the number of teachers, the number of classrooms, supplies, everything, we base it on enrollment because on any one day, all those kids could show up. And so we need to be prepared to handle all of the enrollment. WADA is the weighted number of students. And so we'll look at this in detail. If a student is in a special program like special ed, career tech, bilingual, we get an additional weight. So that kid is worth a little bit more than the 6160. WADA is used when we talk about those golden and copper pennies, whereas ADA is used when we talk about overall Tier 1 entitlement. The ASF, this is the available school fund. This is our per capita payment. So all school districts, no matter how much they pay in recapture, are going to get a little bit of available school fund. And that's represented here with the red sand. This is interesting in that it's based on your prior year average daily attendance for the current year. And then the amount changes all the time, and right now that's estimated at $629 and some change per ADA. MCR, this is a new term that came with House Bill 3 in 2019. And this is your maximum compressed rate on the M&O side. So now the state says if you have property value growth that exceeds 2.5%, we're going to lower your tax rate so that you're not generating revenues on those extra value growths. We now have to have TEA certify that rate, and that happens in early August. So before House Bill 3, school districts had their M&O rate, and it only changed if you had a tax ratification election. Now your M&O rate changes every year, and it's compressed based on this property value growth. Then we have what we call the local fund assignment, and this is what the state thinks you should be generating based on your tax rate, but they're looking at what the state certifies your property values at, not what your local property values are. And so this is why it's really important for us to make sure our state values are close to our local revenues, because if the state thinks we're taxing on a higher property value, they think we have more property tax collections than we really do, and we would have more recapture than we're actually collecting. Yes, sir.
When that's being calculated by the state or calculated locally, are homestead exemptions taken into account in that evaluation?
They are and they're not. It's very complicated in that the state looks at frozen values and homesteads differently than the local appraisal district does. And so that's another rabbit trail we could go down, but I will save that for another presentation. What I want to highlight here is in red, the ADA and the WADA. We don't really know what those numbers are until after the end of the school year. So that's the average for the whole year. Our fiscal year ends in June 30, so it's almost the end of our fiscal year before we actually know the total number of students that showed up. And then this current year state value, we're having to estimate that now. So when we build the budget for next year, I'm estimating what the state is going to tell me our property values are, and I get those on January 31st of each year. So I'm currently estimating what my state values are going to be next January. So that's another complication.
Where are you getting those from? From the local assessor? Or
we get numbers from our local appraisal, and then we compare the ratio from local to state to get that estimate. And if you're off, then it can really affect your calculations. And so House Bill 3 did change this to current state values. They were the prior year, so you didn't have to do that estimate. So moving to current year has been a challenge.
And I'm assuming when you get those numbers from the county, that is also taken into account homestead.
Yes, yes. The locals are definitely taking into account homestead, tax rates, everything that the comptroller doesn't necessarily take into account in their numbers. Okay, so those are the acronyms that we're going to use throughout this presentation. Okay, school districts typically have 3 revenue sources for their operating funds. So from here out, we're going to talk about operations. We know that we get funding from different sources, so our tax rate has 2 different components. We'll look at that, but for all school districts, you have local money, state money, and federal money. This depiction is just an equal part of the pie, but you'll see that that is not how revenues for Dripping Springs are actually allocated. So when we look at local, what makes up the local revenue sources? For us, 98% of our local money is from tax collections. So this isn't all of our money, this is just the part that's local. Other things that fall under local revenues are things like interest income on our investments. So we invest our property tax collections and make a return on that. We get ticket sales from athletic events, fine arts events. That's a very minor part of the total puzzle. The district has had participation fees in the past, which were waived during COVID. And then miscellaneous revenues. We might get a refund from someone. We might get something that doesn't fit anywhere else, and it's just miscellaneous.
Does this part of the discussion apply both to the INS portion and the M&O portion?
No, this is just the M&O portion.
Okay.
This is just our operating fund. Thank you for pointing that out. On the state side, for us, this is going to be the available school fund, the red part here, and then any foundation school program money that we might get. This is going to be on our Tier 1, our MCR tax collections, and if we get state aid on those golden and copper pennies. And again, we're going to look at that. As far as our numbers, about 68% of our state aid is related to available school fund and foundation school program. I want to point out a large portion of that is formula transition grant. And this is money that's set to expire next year. And it was built in so that under House Bill 3, if the district's revenues were worse than they were before the change, then this grant makes you whole so that you weren't losing money as part of House Bill 3. That goes away next year, and it's been some substantial dollars for the district in the past. And then the other part of our state aid is TRS on behalf, and this is really just an accounting entry. So TRS is our retirement plan for all employees in the school district. The state makes a contribution on our behalf for the employer's portion. And so we book a revenue and we book an expense. So these aren't revenues that we really have a control over. They're related to our total payroll cost, and it's just an accounting entry, and it's an offset. So it doesn't really affect the bottom line. And then federal. So this is a little bit of a misnomer. We have some federal money in the general fund, but it's very little. And what that is SHARS, which is a Medicaid program for our children that receive special ed services. We can file reports and get a reimbursement back on that. And then on federal grants, we can charge an indirect cost rate, which is to cover the administrative cost of running a federal program. But this is not our federal revenues from Title I, IDEA B, or ESSER funds that you might have heard about. Those are in a special revenue fund that's outside of the general fund. And so what we're talking about here is just our operating fund. And so in the operations, federal is a very small portion of the total revenues.
Will this presentation be made available on the website?
I believe it is.
Okay.
The recorded presentation definitely will. And then, yeah.
The slideshow, though, link to the slideshow.
Yeah, we'll talk about it and make sure, yeah, I mean, we expect it. It's important to have the context, though.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at property taxes first.
What was that statement you had at the bottom?
Property tax collections do not equal district revenues. So, sorry, I slid over that. So if this jar represents our property tax revenues, this is, or collections, this does not equal the revenues that the district gets to keep. So I want to make that very clear. All right, so we have a total tax rate. So you get your property tax bill, you see one tax rate, but what you don't see on our side of it is that tax rate is broken down into many components. And so those components, first of all, are Tier 1. That's that maximum compressed tax rate based on property value growth and where you were before House Bill 3, where your tax rate was. These dollars are subject to recapture, and this is where the largest amount of our recapture comes into play. Then, for maintenance, this is maintenance and operations, so this is the operating fund. Then there are Tier 2. This is where those golden and copper pennies come in. All school districts can have up to 8 golden pennies and up to 9 copper pennies. All of the copper pennies have to be voter approved. The district cannot just say, I want to go have 3 copper pennies. You have to go through an election to have that. Level 2 recapture kicks in on these copper pennies. Golden pennies are golden because there's no recapture and there's no revenue cap. So the more that those pennies generate for the district keeps all of those dollars, and that's why they're called golden, because they're worth so much more than copper pennies. And then the final portion of the total tax rate is for debt service. That's the INS portion. That is in a separate fund. Those dollars can only be used to pay off voter-approved debt. All right, so that is the breakdown of our total tax rate. And we're going to look at this closer.
Sorry. I like the breakdown on that slide. Do you have for the current tax rate that we have now? Do you have that broken out percentage?
It's coming. It's coming. All right, so let's look at the tiers a little bit closer. So tier 1, remember that's that MCR. In tier 1, this is our foundation entitlement. So that is going to be the size of this jar. It is going to be based on our district and our student characteristics. What does that mean? Are we a fast growth district? We're going to get more money for that. What do our students look like? Do we have a high SPED population? Do we have a low GT population? How many kids actually come to school? All of that, and then that 6160 that we talked about earlier is in this tier 1 calculation, and again, that's on the MCR, that compressed portion of the tax rate that's compressed based on property value growth. That's tier 1. Tier 2, where those golden and copper pennies come into play, this is based on the weighted ADA. So not just the ADA, but the weighted, and it's based on the number of pennies. So remember I said you can have 8 golden. So your tier 2 enrichment is going to depend on how many of those 8 golden, how many of those 9 copper, and then each one of those pennies is guaranteed to yield a certain dollar amount, that guaranteed yield. But again, in tier 2, those are approved by the voters. All right, the maximum compressed tax rate. Again, this is going to look at every school district's property value growth compared to the prior year. The state starts out the year estimating what they think the value growth across the state will be. And I think this past year they were estimating about 4, and most districts saw something north of 20%. So the state was surprised, as well as everybody else, by the property value growth across the state. But again, the MCR is trying to make sure that school districts don't gain more than 2.5% in revenue growth. The way the formulas work, no district can have an MCR less than 90% of any other district. And then if you don't tax at that MCR, the state is going to adjust the 6160 down, and so then you end up with a lower tier 1 entitlement, which means you're going to pay more recapture, potentially, if you're a recaptured district. So there's a lot that goes behind the MCR, and again, TEA certifies that. So in July, after we receive our certified property values from the local appraisal district, we submit that information to TEA. I'm sorry, TEA is the Texas Education Agency. And then they do their calculations and they tell us what our MCR should be. So here's an interesting slide that I borrowed from TASVO, our statewide organization. And this is this year versus last year. So this year being 2022, property value growth, versus 21. So 21 is on the left. And you can see in this year, 204 districts with the highest MCR of 0.9134. That compressed down to 8941, and now there's only 51 districts at that highest. There is a floor, so the state sets a floor that you cannot go below. So last year, Dripping Springs would have been at this floor, 8220, and now we're at the floor of 8046. And remember on the previous slide, you can't be less than 90% of any other district. That's where this floor comes in. So this is another area of school finance that we anticipate the legislature looking at and lowering that floor. I don't have the exact number, but if there hadn't been this floor, our MCR would have been in the 70 cent range. percentage, not 80. But you can see what happened with property value growth. Over here, the purple districts are at the floor, but after 22, property values came in. Most of the state is at that floor. And so that's what's happened across the state this past year. Okay, so now let's look at state aid. So where does state aid come into all of this? So again, we have statutory formulas that determine how much revenue we get to keep from property taxes and whether or not the state is going to contribute into that revenue amount. So we have our Tier 1 entitlement, and that's going to be represented here. We have our golden pennies and our copper pennies. So these are our golden pennies and these are our copper pennies. So let's look at the Tier 1 entitlement. So how do we determine if our revenue jar is this size or this size? So remember, our entitlement is the revenues that we're entitled to keep. So we're going to start with the basic allotment, which is 6160. We're going to add rates for special populations. So the bigger kids here are worth more money because they're in a special population. And then we're going to get an additional allotment for certain programs. And so we're going to look at what those are. So there's a lot going on here. But we're going to start at the top with 6160. And then we're going to look at all these special populations. So is the child in a compensatory ed program, meaning they might be getting tutoring or special supports because they're at risk of dropping out or failing? Then we have special education, career technology, early education, bilingual. So kids are going to be weighted for those different programs. What's interesting here is I have the little babies as our pre-K kids. All of the research shows that the sooner you can start educating a child, the more successful they will be. But our pre-K students only get funded for half. So they don't even get the 6160. And that's been my beef with school finance for years. And then with House Bill 3, the state said you have to have a full-day pre-K program. But they do not change this, so these babies are only worth half of what an 11th grader or an 8th grader is worth. So then we have special allotments, so we get additional money when we open a new school for supplies. That's called new instructional facility, so that's not to build a school. But the state recognizes that when you open a school, you have additional operating costs because the school doesn't just come with all the library books and the desks and everything else. So we get an allotment in a year that we open a school. We get, so that was NIFA, fast growth. So because we are a fast growth district, we get an additional allotment for that.
Can you quickly state what recognition we have to be hitting to be recognized, the stipulation?
For fast growth? I was afraid someone was going to ask that.
I'm just pointing out, it's not because we say we're fast.
No,
There's an actual
it's
formula
very difficult to forecast at this point in the year because the state takes the growth for every school district in the state and then ranks them. And so you have to hit a certain tier of ranking. So unless I know exactly how fast Liberty Hill is growing and Del Valley and all the districts around me and across the state, I don't know where I fall in that ranking. So we kind of estimate what we think we're going to get, but we really don't know that until the end of the year. So it's complicated. Nothing is easy. So we're going to determine how much Tier 1 revenue we get, how big is our jar going to be, and that's going to be, again, based on all of our kids. So we throw our kids in. Throw all my kids in here. That's all the kids I have, and that's all I get. But we're going to take some out because they don't all come to school. So remember, they're enrolled, but they don't come, so we don't get funding for them. So if I want to make this jar bigger, what do I have to do?
Get more kids in the school system.
Exactly. I get more funding based on the number of kids. So if all the kids are in the jar, I'm going to need a bigger jar, so I'm going to go here.
And when you say not coming to school, I just want to clarify, those are kids who are enrolled but are missing more than like 11 days a year, right?
Just missing anything.
Okay.
So we count every day.
That's
So this assumes that all my kids come to school every day. Some don't, so whether they miss one day or 5 days or half of the year, we don't get the 60.
That's still, we're still counting, right?
No. If they're not there,
They
if
have
they're
to
not
be
there.
here at attendance taking
Yeah.
time to be counted. So if you have dentist appointments, make them after attendance, because if they're absent, we don't get funding.
Just one day and that child is not counted for the rest of the year? or
No,
just for that day?
that 6160 for the year is slightly less, because they didn't come every day.
Okay.
Then we're gonna add in these special allotments that we get in school safety. I put it on here because it's on here. It's like $9.72 a kid. And then if you'll notice, anything that has an asterisk, so the new instructional facilities allotments, school safety, GT, fast growth, those allotments are capped. So the state put a certain dollar amount for that allotment. If more school districts qualified and they have money, then it's prorated. So for instance, new instructional facilities allotment, we're supposed to get $1,000 per ADA for the first year school opens. But last year, the state had more new schools than they had money, and so that $1,000 was prorated down to 900 or 800 and something. I don't have the exact number. So if it's capped, then that doesn't mean you necessarily earned the money that you think. And then we do get some money for transportation. So this is the size of our jar. So again, if all of my kids fit here, this would be my entitlement. The only way to make this grow bigger is have more kids, right?
Or more programs?
Or more kids in those weighted programs. Did this jar grow because of property taxes? Just on kids. So now we've got to determine who's going to pay for everything in this jar.
When you're saying more kids, you're talking about attendance
Yes. Well, and enrollment.
and enrollment, yeah.
Because the only way to make this jar grow is to put more of these elements in there. So let's look at one example. So if this is my Tier 1 entitlement, this is depicted here by the circle. This jar is what I'm entitled to earn. Who's going to pay for the jar? Is it going to be the local school district, or is it going to be the state? So first, the available school funds come into play. So again, remember this is 629 for prior year ADA. So we're going to put it in first. This is going to be fun to take notes. All right, so it's really just a small percentage of the total, so we're going to stop there. So now, who fills the rest of the jar? The first thing that's going to happen is we're going to look at our local fund assignment. And again, this is what the state thinks we're going to generate based on our state values and our tax rate. So this is that MCR tax rate, not the golden or copper pennies. This is our basic Tier 1 entitlement. So first, we're going to pretend that the tax collections field part of the jar. Okay, so that's all the tax collections we had. Is my jar full? No? So tax collections did not fill this. So that means the state is going to participate in the Tier 1 entitlement, and they're going to give us some money until we get to the top. Then the jar is full, right? So that's all we're going to get from the state. That's a scenario where you're not paying recapture. So the state participates in the cost, and you're done with your Tier 1 entitlement. So there's the state coming in to fill the pie. Let's look at the scenario where we get the available school fund, we get the red. With the green, now the green, where's my scoop? All right, we're going to scoop out the blue.
Practice this.
I have not. So you're not gonna see it, you're gonna pretend you don't see any blue in there. Rust won't come out. All right, we're just gonna pretend you don't see any blue. Now my tax collections fill the jar all the way to the top. Just perfect. I don't need any state aid because there's no room for it, right? So this is just perfect. Tax collections meet the tier 1. We're done. There's no room for blue, so the state is not participating. So in this case, no recapture, but no state aid. Then, let's say our tier 1 entitlement is that big. We get the available school fund, that's still in the jar. But now our local tax collections, make room for this. Now, these are our tax collections. There's no room, right? So what happens to this? Joseph? Joseph is bad TEA. He comes along, sweeps up. So I don't have room for blue sand. I have too much green sand. Guess where it's going?
Too much revenue.
It's going where? Anyone know? It's going back to the state is recapture.
It's turning blue for other schools.
It's turning, well, not necessarily for other schools. It's going into the state's budget, and they can do anything they want with it.
When it was known as Robin Hood, it was reallocated. And legislatively, I was gonna ask that question, so you can point that out. Do we know what recapture actually funds, or it is a general state fund?
It's a general revenue for the state, and it's the state's way of getting money for local property taxes. That didn't seem all. So we're in the situation that we have to tax at that MCR. Remember, this was just the MCR. I have to tax there. If the state says I can only have this much revenue because that's the kids that filled up the jar and all the other programs. So because this jar was bigger, they spilled over and went back to the state.
That M in MCR, you meant maximum or minimum?
Maximum.
So, I don't understand. I mean, did the excess revenue come from having collected too much taxes, and then that was mandated by the state, that tax level was mandated? So that sounds like a minimum.
It sounds like a minimum, but they call it the
Or a
maximum compression.
Because it's the maximum rate you can have. So that's what you're compressed down. Well, it's really, for us, it's our maximum rate, because if we go back here, so remember, our maximum rate is 8046. If we didn't have property value growth like we had, we could be at 8941, but for us, our maximum compressed rate is 8046.
Can a school district, or the taxpayers in the school district, they can appeal to the state and say, look, at this rate, we're collecting all this excess. Is there an appeal process for that?
That's part of why we're talking to legislatures this session, because I'm pretty sure they're going to lower this floor. I don't know what this floor is going forward because it hasn't been set. As far as I know, we're all guessing. If they're going to lower this floor, most likely, but remember, if my tax collections go down, then I need more blue sand. So compression costs the state money. The state doesn't want to spend money on education, they want to spend it other places. So they're happy to take our tax dollars because it's just giving them more money. But they are looking at property tax relief this coming session. I don't know if it'll be in the form of this, or an increase on the homestead exemption, or a combination of both. I had a conversation with Glenn Hager. He doesn't have any ideas other than homestead exemption or compression, but he also said that costs me money. I said, I know, so what is your solution? He doesn't necessarily relatively
Yeah.
more.
Can we speak, it might be a question for Holly, can we speak as to our legislative priorities as a district as it relates to that it is a legislative priority? I'm speaking just as Olivia here, reaching out to our state reps. We have state rep 45 and state rep 73. State rep of 73 has already put it out that this is a high priority, but it's going to come from the citizens and the taxpayers, reaching out to the state reps, letting them know that it's a priority to taxpayers.
And we were pro last time when they moved the homestead exemption from 25,000 to 45,000, because in a district like ours where our taxpayers are paying fully for the schools, that's really important that our taxpayers are able to keep as much money as they can. So we were pro the increase of the homestead exemption. The reality is Elaine's actually going to do a whole session on recapture because we think this is an important topic for our community. Our community needs to understand how recapture works, and they need to understand how to advocate for that, because the reality is it's unique in Texas schools. And we have a lot of people moving from out of state, they don't understand that this is a part of the school system. And so they don't understand that your money is coming to us, but eventually flowing through the state, and we can't control that or stop that. So we have to tell our legislators that this is very important in this session for us as a community, that we feel like our local funding, we wanted to fund our schools, we think that's important, but we also don't want to be sending so much back to the state that they're spending it on other things. If it were staying in education, like you had said, which it used to do, that would be valuable, right? Because then we understand the importance of education. And if we were getting this much money and it were staying here and going elsewhere, then education would be getting more funding. But the reality is in Texas, education is funded at the lowest level compared to the other 50 states. And so we have to help advocate for it. If we're going to be taking in this much tax collection, so we need to use it for education, not just for the state to fill more money in their coffers and it to go other places.
Why couldn't it go directly back to the taxpayers instead?
And we'd be fine with that too, but right now, we're just making excess collections, we're not keeping it, and so people see homes and they think, oh, all that money's going to school, and that's why we're trying to help them understand it doesn't get to stay with us, and it doesn't even go to education anymore, it just goes back to the state. And so that's why we're making this an important conversation with our community to help understand now is the time to advocate, because it's a legislative year.
This MCR number, is that a single number for the entirety of the state, or does the state calculate a different number for each district?
They're calculating a different number for each district. So they're looking at Dripping Springs and saying they can bring in a lot of property values that we're going to set on here. They're making sure that their blue part doesn't go up.
When it becomes apparent, and not just apparent, but obvious that that calculation is incorrect, I mean, again, shouldn't they adjust that downward? I mean, if this is chronically happening to us in our district.
I mean, theoretically, and that's why Elaine showed you the chart, it's not just happening to our district, it's happening to our state. It's happening all across the state of Texas, and the problem is that funding is going back to the state, which is why we're all hearing that this biennium, they have such a big excess rainy day fund. It's coming from public education and local taxpayers paying in, which is why tax collections and tax compression is such an important conversation this legislative session.
There's no language in existing legislation or surrounding this issue about this specific phenomenon that's going on?
There is language. It's what's creating the phenomenon. And we're trying to advocate with our community to help people understand that this phenomenon especially impacts us, but it really impacts the state as a whole.
Is that property taxes coming from commercial as well as residential?
In some districts, our districts, like we don't have a Galleria. When you think about other school districts, they have much bigger commercial property than we have. Dripping Springs is a rooftop community. It's all of us as community members living here who are paying that tax because we just don't have that much. I mean, Home Depot isn't, when you think about like the big centers that you see in Austin, you know, Tesla and Del Valley, those types of, you know, big commercial estates, that's what's paying the taxes there. So some districts, it's really helpful when you have those big commercial properties because they pay in so much tax, they take it off of the taxpayer. Here, we're local. It's us together that are paying this. And so that's why we're trying to help people understand where it comes from and what's happening with it.
And it's important for the community to understand that it's the board that yearly makes that rate and that they've been making it be the lowest maximum compressed rate.
We are,
Right, at the lowest.
So
We
the
are
board
getting
doesn't
the
have any
government.
say over the MCR. The
No, but
state tells
But
Our
us.
tax rate though, our local
Our,
tax rate.
our tax rate, where we have options is when we get into these tier 2 plans.
But they have been voting to stay,
yes,
Like,
we're
not go
staying at the
above it.
bottom of our option.
yes, to
Yes.
stay as low as we can without being penalized.
Yes.
Yeah,
Because you can't go above it. You have to be at that MCR.
okay.
You mentioned that the recapture dollars, they used to go back to education, but now they go to the general fund. Do we know to what extent, I mean, what part of the overall state budget is funded by what this defect going on?
Is it 3 billion that went in this year? and
Last year, the school districts paid over $3 billion. This year is estimated at $4.6 billion. It's a very small portion of the entire state budget, but it's very big to education. This $3 billion would have restored all of those cuts that were made to those specific programs because they didn't allocate enough money. Okay, so we're going to switch gears and focus now on the tier 2 pennies and get an understanding of copper and golden. So remember, golden are golden because there's no recapture on these, and they are guaranteed to yield 98.56 per weighted ADA. So we're going to look at how that works, and then the copper. So Dripping Springs has all 8 of the 8 that you can have. You can have 9 copper pennies. Dripping Springs had 9 copper pennies, but they've been compressed down to 5.83. And it says only with voter approval. So that happened in this community in 2016. We went to the voters, we asked them to lower the INS rate and move those pennies to the M&O rate. The voters overwhelmingly approved it. And so we had 9 copper, 8 golden. Those have been compressed down so that they now, they're copper because they only are guaranteed to yield $49 and some change, and they're subject to recapture. So let's look at what that really looks like. The slides are not flowing the way I want them to. Okay, so remember earlier when we said school districts have 3 revenue sources: state, local, and federal dollars. In actuality, for operations for Dripping Springs, 88% of our revenues for operations are from local revenues. Remember, 98% of local revenues are tax collections. State is 11%, and that comes in the form of the red sand and really the fast growth allotment. So we don't get any of this blue sand. We get one of those allotments that helps fill this jar. And then federal and operations and general fund is just 1%. It's a very small percentage of our total operating revenues. Our current tax rate is $1.2921. So let's look at how that's broken down. Someone asked. So we start with the 8046, and compared to what the state says we can have, that's the 8046. So we can't have higher than that on the tier 1 MCR. And if we go lower than that, we get penalized and we're paying more recapture because we wouldn't get the full 6160 that determines the amount of this jar, right? Then we have the golden pennies. So we have 8. The state says we can have 8. We have 5.83 copper pennies. State says we can have 9. So if we wanted to go back up to 9, we'd have to go back out to the voters and get approval for that. For debt service, we're at 35 cents. The max you can have from the state is 50 cents. So our total tax rate over here is this $1.2929. Legally, the state says we could have up to $1.4746, but we would have to get voter approval to go back up here, and we would have to approve more bonds to need an increase in our INS rate. So that's where we are. Historically,
I'm sorry, the maximum tax rate is to cover both M&O and INS combined?
yes, so this is the total tax rate, both pieces. And remember, we've just been focusing on the operations, everything below the INS level. Historically, we were at $1.50 way back in 2005. That was the max on the MO rate. That dropped in 2006. I'm not sure what happened in 2006. In 2007, I do know there was a change in the state law, and the max you could have was $1.04. So the district went to $1.04. And then these are the years that districts didn't really have an opportunity to change their M&O rate unless they went to the voters and did a TRE. And that's what happened in 2016. So that $1.04 increased to $1.17, and we lowered the INS rate so it wasn't an overall increase. Stayed at $1.17, and then in 2019, House Bill 3 came into effect. And then this tax rate had to start dropping based on property value growth. So the 94.29 you see here is that MCR, 80.46, plus the copper and golden pennies. So we're at 94.29 for M&O. So historically, since House Bill 3 in 2019, this 94.29 represents an almost 23-cent drop in the M&O rate. And it's the lowest since, I went back, we had records, I don't remember what year in the 1980s, but this is the lowest number it's been since somewhere in the 1980s. When you look at the other component of the tax rate, the INS rate, again, going back to 2005, we were with 32.6 cents. You see a drop and then an increase. It got up to 45 cents in 2008. It stayed there, went up to 48 cents as a reflection of the 2014 bond program. So when that bond was approved, we needed 48 cents to pay for those bond projects. Then in 2016, we lowered it to 35 cents. We did that exchange, increased the M&O, lowered the INS, and we've been able to maintain 35 cents to pay for all existing debt, and that was going to service the new debt that went to the voters in November.
This exchange from M&O to INS, is that something that you could just arbitrarily do anytime you want to, or was it enabled by the fact that debt payments were actually lower at that time? I mean, what's...
So we had to do it through voter approval. So as a school district, we can't just manage the overall tax rate. We can't say, well, we don't need this on INS, but we really need it on M&O. You can't do that. You have to go to the voters. This is when we said, okay, well, we've got some property value growth, and this is where we hit recapture again. So we were going back into recapture. We didn't need all of the 48 cents for debt. So we said we really need it on operations because we're going to pay recapture. That's going to cut into our budget. And so we went to the voters and they approved that exchange. So that's where the INS tax rate is today. Okay, so this is where I wanted to get into the golden and copper pennies. So again, this is tier 2. So we've talked about tier 1. That's the one that made the mess. So last year, 2021, our golden pennies, remember, they're guaranteed to yield 98.56 per watt. So the watt that year was 8,941. So when you take our 8 pennies times the watt times this, our tier 2 golden penny jar, tax collections only filled part of it. So you can see tax collections, tax effort, got us $6,000. But we were entitled to generate $98.56, which would have been a little over $7 million. So the state had to actually kick in some money for us to hit that yield. So those golden pennies last year were really golden because not only do we not pay recapture on them, the state had to pay some. So we got some more state aid on those. The copper pennies, they're going to yield 49.28. So we have 5.83. So the 49 times the 5 pennies times the same watta, the 21.22, our entitlement was 2.6 million. So on the copper pennies, we should have gotten 2.6. Our tax collections actually were 4.3. So we ended up paying 1.8 in recapture on these copper pennies. So the copper are worth less because they only yield $49 and they're subject to recapture. So that was last year. What happened between 21-22 and 22-23? Property values increased a lot. So in this year, property values increased 17%. For this year, they increased 28%. So the only thing that changes is how much of this jar will the tax collections fill. So on the golden pennies, again, still worth $98.56, still have 8. We're entitled to $7.5 million, but our tax effort, these 8 pennies on these higher property values and higher WADA, because our WADA increases with our enrollment and our attendance. So we were entitled to 7.5. Our jar generated 7.542. We got to keep that. So that's why these are so golden. But you'll notice the state didn't have to kick in anything for these to yield what they're guaranteed to yield. So that's why they're so golden. The copper pennies, on the other hand, the property values went up, the water went up, the yield is still the same. So now the 5 pennies on these values generate 5.5 million. Our guaranteed yield is 2.7. So on the copper pennies, we actually pay more recapture. And so the question becomes, why do we keep these copper pennies? So we're keeping 2.6. So these pennies this year are generating 2.6 million. Some people might say, well, let's just get rid of them. Well, those copper pennies basically fund our athletics and our fine arts programs. Their budget, when you look at their total budget, is about 2.6 million. So if we said we don't want to tax on these copper pennies, I would need to cut 2.6 from our budget. So that would leave less for raises for teachers, and we would have to trim other programs. So on this chart, what I've attempted to do is show you in our budget, how do these pennies equate? So remember the tier 1, the MCR, our gross collections, this big jar was worth 76 million, but we only got to keep 55 million. So that basically funds our classroom teachers and their supplies and the maintenance budget. So the budget to maintain our facilities and pay utilities, plus our classroom teachers eats up our tier 1 entitlement. That's why those tier 2, these are called enrichment. So if we didn't have these pennies, this would be all the revenue we have. We sought these pennies back in 2016 so that we could enhance this program. So those golden pennies that are worth 7.542, that's the equivalent of our total transportation budget and our campus leadership. What is campus leadership? That is principals, assistant principals, their secretarial staff, the staff that take attendance every day. So our budget equates to about what the golden pennies are generating, and then again, extracurricular equates to the copper pennies. Of course, that's not our entire budget. We have other costs, and those are funded through the little bit of state aid we get, and then our other local and federal revenues.
And it's not like those specific dollars are specifically allocated to those specific things. You're just matching up, I know, roughly what the numbers.
Exactly.
Okay.
No, we don't say, oh, this penny goes
Right.
here. I'm just trying to look for what do those equate to.
Excuse me a second. I'm kind of getting lost along the way here. This tier 1, tier 2, golden and copper pennies, that's all state legislated? So this has all been fabricated by our people that were voting,
Yes.
who decided this is the way to provide state funding. And then they decided that, gee, this money's coming in, so let's spend it somewhere else. If you could...
Yes. Now, the reason that these are guaranteed to yield a certain dollar amount is because if I'm Del Valley and I just got Tesla, now my penny might generate a lot more money than it did the year before. So this whole recapture system is put into place so that if Del Valley gets Tesla and now can pay their teachers $100,000, and poor Dripping doesn't have a Tesla and he can only pay $60,000, we would never get a teacher, right? And so this recapture system is so that all school districts across the state are on somewhat a level playing field. And so that's why these are guaranteed to yield a certain dollar amount, and anything above that they want to take back, so that I can't say, ooh, I'm going to get 9 copper pennies and I'm going to have $20 billion and I can pay teachers a ton of money and no one else can compete with me. And that happens in our neighborhood all the time, with Taylor getting Samsung and Maynard, and so this keeps it where we're all kind of in the same funding formulas.
But it costs us
But it costs us,
$20
yes.
million last year.
We're looking at 23 this year. So here's a breakdown of our budget. This pie excludes recapture. So if you just look at our pure dollars for budget, 83% of our budget is in payroll. That's all positions. So that's bus drivers, custodians, payroll, classroom teachers, aides, coaches, principals. All of our payroll takes up 83% of the dollars that we have available. So when you start talking cuts to make anything substantial, it's hard to not cut positions. Then the next biggest is contract services, and this is where we're talking about maintenance and repairs on things, legal, audit, all of those contracted things. Utilities is also a contracted service, but we break it out. Supplies, this can include classroom supplies, maintenance supplies. So if there's a part on an air conditioner that goes out, it's going to be in supplies. It's going to include fuel for buses. We now have to count for our copier leases differently, so we call those lease payments. They're in a different code now. And then travel, miscellaneous, and capital outlay are really small portions. When you factor in recapture, however, that takes 20% of our total costs. So then when you factor it in, yes, payroll is still the largest piece, but now you have a lot less to allocate among the different areas. And then we look at it by functional area. So in this chart, it's by object. What kind of expense is it? Is it payroll? Is it supplies? Is it capital outlay? In this chart, we look at exactly where is it being spent. Is it being spent in the classroom? Is it being spent on counselors or nurses? Is it on extracurricular? So you can see between the classroom and library, that's about half of our dollar goes there. Then 20 cents of every dollar goes to recapture. And then you have a little bit left to spread among the other areas. So you have outside of payroll, maintenance, and facilities is our next biggest cost. So that's why we're always looking for more efficient systems, because we don't want to be using old, dilapidated systems. We want to make sure we're energy efficient here. Transportation is 4.3 cents of our dollar, and you can see it just broken down as you move along. We made it.
So we pay recapture with the tax rate. The state says you must set a tax rate at a certain level or higher. You can set it.
Well, only fees can be higher than your voter approval.
I'm sorry, or you can set it.
You can't set it low. Remember that the MCR that funds this has to be at what the state tells you.
Okay.
Can't be higher, can't be lower.
So they tell you it's going to be a certain level, and you're going to have to pay recapture because the state doesn't allow you to adjust your rate down to the level that does not include recapture.
Yes, he's saying you can't make.
I can't make this go lower. I can't lower my tax collections to get out of recapture.
Right, so as a taxpayer, you know, you might say, I'm being taxed at a certain rate. I want you to reduce the rate so we don't pay recapture. But you
That
can't
many,
do that.
many
But
times.
you can't do that.
Cannot do that.
So the message to the citizens is that your rate is not set at a certain level to assure recapture, and the state spends some of that recapture on non-educational expenses.
That is correct.
And to me, that's an important message that, I mean, we can all bring back that, you know, again, it's our state legislature. You know, it's who did we vote for last time? And, you know, where do they stand on this? You know, are they going to address this? I don't have an issue with funding across the state for all students at a fair level. But deceiving us into thinking that our money is going into education when some of it is going into this big general budget, this big slush fund, is a big issue.
It is a big issue, and it's really become a big issue because property values went out the roof. And no one saw that coming, especially after the pandemic. And so I thought, I used to have a slide in here about our recapture, I don't know where it went. If you look at our recapture history, 8 million, 10 million, it's jumped to 23 million this year and projected even higher. My former district is projected 70 million next year, their second year in recapture. So recapture has become a huge problem. House Bill 3 was supposed to fix that, and it did. After 2019, recapture went down a little bit, then property values jumped, and so recapture across the state has just blossomed. And so the state has to address that.
I've heard often just the term regarding the tax rate, a no new revenue rate. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so there are 4 or 5 tax rates we have to calculate for truth in taxation purposes. What we're really set to is that MCR. So the no new revenue rate is theory supposed to say, okay, if you had 20 million in revenues last year and your values went up this is the rate you would need to generate an additional, or that same 20 million this year. But then it takes into account, did you have more students? So there's a lot of factors that go into there. It's not what we're held to, we're held to the MCR.
So there's nothing the district, there's nothing that doesn't apply to the district at all, setting
It applies to us in that we have to calculate it. But then it doesn't apply to us in that it has no impact on the MCR.
But does it have, on the, but on the other one, does it have an impact? The INS? No. So who would be able to set that, a no new revenue rate? Like, is that a rate that can be set by anyone?
The counties, cities and counties, they have a different formula and a different structure, and they have to calculate that as well. There's a no new revenue rate, and there's a no new MO revenue rate that we have to calculate. And neither one of them are the MCR. And so it's, to me, it's very confusing to the taxpayers. And we went through this with the board in September, and went through all the tax rates we have to calculate. But at the end of the day, it's the MCR that TEA certifies.
I know we're over, but if you could just briefly touch for me on the INS and why we keep it at 35.
So we keep it at 35 in anticipation of new bonds coming online so that we don't have to increase the tax rate at that point. So it is servicing our debt, and we use anything extra to pay off debt early. So if the collections are more than we need each year to service the outstanding debt, we pay off debt early through what's called defeasance.
Are you required to pay off the debt early, or you're choosing to do that?
No, we're choosing to do that to keep the tax rate stable.
It's also saving a lot of money on the interest that we can be paying, just
Well,
like we pay something else.
Yeah, but if future debt is at a higher interest rate, then I disagree with that statement. I mean, if your future debt that you're going to take on is at a much higher rate, it's better to keep the lower interest debt, to keep that lower interest debt at that lower interest rate.
When you're gonna add on later, then and pay more than the 35 cents in order to finance the
But
debt.
the portion of the debt that needs to be retained, that portion of the debt would be at a lower rate. Otherwise, if you pay that, I mean, this is what I do in my own finances at home. If I've got credit card at a higher interest rate and my mortgage at a lower interest rate, every extra dollar I go to pay off the credit card debt sooner.
But we've got a higher,
If I can just summarize this, what I understand with the recapture, it's coming from two places, right? The MCR and the copper pennies. And the MCR, there's nothing to do about it.
Correct.
And then with the copper pennies, in theory, if we were to say, let's drop that 5.83, we're taking away from operations, taking away from teachers and all of that. And I want to circle back then to the conversation about the AC systems and maintenance, right? If we go ahead and do the patchwork costs to maintain the AC instead of updating it, it's going to affect that 5.83 in essence, right? So to me, that's another reason not to just patch it, do it out of INS, get it right, and potentially then one could reduce 5.83.
Potentially. We don't know what's going to happen in this session, so we could get to May when we adopt budget and the playing field is completely different. All we know right now is current law, and so this is the way current law works. I think it's really important to understand this because if this 6160 increases, then that helps the size of our jar and we pay less recapture, right? So that increase helps. It does cost the state because if I'm paying less recapture, then the revenue source is going down. But this is one thing that we're really hoping for. A change to the floor on the MCR will definitely be addressed soon. And then whether or not there's homestead adjustments.
Yeah,
This is what we're living under today. And this is completely different than it was before House Square.
I think it's just a cost to doing something on the maintenance side versus just getting a new system. Because if you could take that cost out of the maintenance side of things, in theory, one could possibly reduce some of the recapture on the copper pennies.
Exactly.
Right? So
And
you just have to
those
wait.
INS pennies are not subject to recapture.
Yeah.
So when you're in a recapture district like this, you want to put as much as you can in a bond because those dollars go further. You don't pay recapture. They can be used to replace facility system basically. Whereas over here, I'm paying recapture.
Students with A lunch should be moving to A lunch now.
Well, I want to remind you all, so this is part of a whole series. So this was really laying the floor and the foundation for a whole lot of what comes next. School finance is a big thing, and so I know we're trying to answer other questions, but we're going to get into some of that in even more detail in some of our future sessions. So February 7th, we're going to be talking about taxes and debt management, and so that's a perfect time for us to come back, take this conversation, and continue it on to the INS side. And then we also want to have a segment on recapture where we can talk about kind of how this impacts us, how it impacts our local community, and the things that we can be talking about and the way that some of these changes would help us legislatively. And so I think we've got a lot more to come. We hope y'all will come back and join us. We're a little over time this time. And so we'll start to wrap up, but we hope that we'll see you again every month at the first Tuesday of the month. We'll be together. And so always from 9:30 to 11:30, and we'll switch campuses so you get an opportunity to see our different schools and really understand and meet those principals and those campus administrators and understand what those schools are like. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you for doing
When we meet the objectives, can you explain this to your neighbors?